my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Raphael BenLevi, who is a fellow at the Misgav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy in Jerusalem. He is also the director of the Churchill Program for National Security at the Argaman Institute and a major in the reserves of the IDF intelligence branch. He is the author of the book, Cultures of Counterproliferation, The Making of American and Israeli Policy on the Iranian Nuclear Program. He received his Ph.D. from Bar-Ilan University, his M.A. from Reichman University, which is in Herzliya, and his Bachelor of Science from the Technion in Haifa. Dr. BenLevi will address a particularly significant and timely topic, the war on Israel's northern front, what is at stake, and what can be done. And with that introduction, please begin.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Leonard, for inviting me, and thank everyone here for joining us. Yeah, it's become an even more relevant topic than we thought a month ago when we set the date. So I'm going to show you some slides, and then at some point we'll come off slides, we'll talk for a bit, and then we will open for questions. So, one sec there. Let me see if it will let me show my PowerPoint. And I don't seem to be able to do that. How about that? It worked before. No, it doesn't want to. Let's try it one more time. Sure. Okay. Don't seem to be able to do that, but maybe it's better off. I will just talk to you directly then. Okay. So what I want to talk about with you today, I would split into three topics here. First, I want to give the general or more broader political context of the current war. And before we talk about the specific situation in the north, then I want to talk about the situation in the north, a little bit of history about it, what Israel has done before and what we can learn from it. And then I want to talk about what Israel's options are, and sort of compare them and see what really can be done and what couldn't be done. Okay. So first, in order to understand the broader context of what's going on in this current war, we need to understand the various camps that are present in the Middle East today. So I divide these into 4 different local camps and 3 external superpower actors. Okay, so the first local camp would be Sunni Islamism, and this would include, of course, the mostly non-state actors of the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic State, and previously Al-Qaeda, Islamic Jihad, and also Qatar and Turkey as state actors who ideologically support this camp, although they're also a little bit more pragmatic as far as what their actual policies are. The second camp is Shiite Islamism, of course, led by the Islamic Republic of Iran, with its set of proxies, terror proxies, Hizballah and Houthi, and the various proxies in Iraq and Syria, and more or less aligned with the state of Syria with Assad regime. The third camp I call traditionalist Arab monarchies. And this is, of course, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, across North Africa, Morocco. It also includes Jordan and Egypt, and Azerbaijan, who are both Arab and Muslim, but are not Islamist, and they are attempting to, their status quo powers, who, and many of them want to promote their progress into the modern world, at least as far as their prosperity of their citizens. First, the final camp is Israel, representing, as far as if I put it, the previous into ideological terms or political ideological terms, we're representing Jewish nationalist modern democracy, and all that together. Now, if you look at the alignments between them, the camp of Israel is more or less aligned with the traditionalist Arab monarchies, who are then both at odds with both Sunni Islamism and Shia Islamism. Sunni Islamists threatening the traditionalist Arab monarchies from the inside, and Shiites on the outside, and both of them threatening Israel mainly from the outside. If now we look at we take a step out, we want to look at the three superpowers who are active or most active in the Middle East. This is, of course, the United States, Russia, and China. So I want to say a few words about each of them. So the United States, I'm going to break it down to interests and policies. Okay, what are the fundamental interests of the United States in the Middle East? Of course, it is the largest military presence. It's the more dominant superpower in the Middle East. It has the most bases and active personnel at any point in time. The U.S. is interested in continuing the flow of energy to the world energy markets, preventing the export of terrorism, preventing nuclear proliferation. It also seeks to maintain, by being a dominant presence in the Middle East, it seeks to maintain levers over its superpower competitors. Although it also wants to maintain this status with minimum direct military involvement and resources. Meaning, if 20 years ago, of course, the United States was directly active militarily in Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, it doesn't want to give up on its basic footprint of bases, and it can't really give up on the basic interests, even though it's less dependent on the actual oil that's coming out. It's still dependent on all those interests that I outlined. It both across the board, across Republican, Democratic administrations, the U.S. wants to do less directly. That's definitely clear. So its policies are basically aligned with Arab monarchies and Israel. Of course, this includes Turkey and Qatar, which is nominally aligned with and cooperates with on security issues, although there's a lot more tension in those two relationships. And the current Biden administration is seeking to find some sort of way to come to terms with Iran in a way that will lead to relative stabilization of the region so that it can continue to do less and focus on its bigger fish in the global arena, which is, of course, China. And that has been something that the Biden administration has been pursuing since the beginning of its administration, since the beginning of its term, and in some ways is still trying to hold on to that today, finding a way to come to terms, find a deal with Iran that will leave the region relatively stable. It is also trying to find a way to bring about normalization and more formalized diplomatic relations and economic relations between Israel and the rest of the Arab monarchies that it doesn't have them with yet. And then in doing so, to create an economic corridor that will be some sort of alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And that they're trying to pursue both of those axes at the same time. In some ways they are at odds, but they're still trying to square the circle. Okay, Russia. What does Russia want in the Middle East? So its basic interests are, first of all, the Middle East is not the primary area of concern for Russia. It is a secondary area, but it is important because it wants to be able to project power into the Mediterranean, naval power into the Mediterranean directly. And the Middle East impacts another area of direct concern, which is the Caucasus. So Russia has the interest since 2015. It has more direct military presence. It has its port in Tartus for a long time, but of course, since it came to the aid of the Assad regime, then it is a military actor in the region, but it's more or less contained to the Syrian arena. By doing this, by having this presence, even though it's a secondary area of concern, it's able to gain leverage over the various actors that impact its primary area of concern, which is Eastern Europe and in the past 2 years, Ukraine. And so it is still wants to be involved. It wants to be an actor that has a say in things, or that has to be taken into account for things that go on in the Middle East, even though it's not directly. It wants to also to be able to coordinate oil prices with the oil exporters in the Middle East. And it has some identity, cultural ties to religious sites of the Orthodox Church in Israel. His policies is in some ways to maintain workable relations with everyone, but in the past 2 years, of course, it's fundamentally here in the past 7 or 8 years, it's here to support the Assad regime. And in the past 2 years, it's been a lot more cooperative with Iran. Now, Russia's cooperation with Iran has been full of tensions for years. It still is, but in the past 2 years, because Iran has come to Russia's aid on Ukraine, supplying it with tech and drones, the side of that works against their close cooperation is less strong, and that means that Russia is a little bit more beholden to Iran's interests in Syria. Okay, our final superpower in the Middle East is, of course, China. Now, this is also a secondary region of interest for China. China's primary region of interest, of security interest, certainly is East Asia itself, East Asia and the seas surrounding it. But China has important interests in the Middle East. Of course, it is the source of energy as opposed to the United States. It is a direct source of energy. China imports a significant amount of its energy from both Saudi Arabia and Iran. It is also a significant path for goods coming for shipping of both of things coming into China and going out of China, which would be a big problem for China if they wasn't flowing. And of course, in the broader context, the Middle East is a bridge. It is an important bridge in the BRI, in the Belt and Road Initiative. It's looking to establish ports, of course, first in Pakistan, in the Indian Ocean, but then from there to Africa, the edge of Africa, eastern edge of Africa, Horn of Africa, and then also throughout the Middle East. And then it's also, therefore, in policy terms, it used to be limited up until a few years ago, 10 years ago, significantly, but a lot more in the past few years. We would say that China was primarily interested in trading with Middle Eastern countries and oil. But in the past years, it's clear that it is also beginning to establish a military footprint and also wants to be more involved diplomatically or strategically. So that can be both its bases in Horn of Africa, its bases in Pakistan, and its interest in selling drones and other arms to the Gulf states. And what it's and of course, just within the past 2 years, it's offering itself as the moderator to renew diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, meaning China positions itself as the broker, as the alternative broker to the United States, and it's essentially saying to people, look, or selling primarily to the Gulf states, they're trying to say, look, the Americans are unreliable. You cannot rely on the Americans. Look what Iran's proxies did to you with your drone attacks in the Persian Gulf, and the United States didn't do much about it. And of course, this is very significant for Saudi Arabia and UAE. And what they're essentially saying is, we have the leverage over Iran to sort of rein them in for you diplomatically. So abandon the U.S. and give us and we have a better role. We can play that role better. Now, this is still sort of in its early stages. Like I said, the U.S. has a much stronger military footprint. It doesn't seem to want to be giving that up anytime soon. But China is waiting for that to happen. And if it does happen, China will then take control of, or be the actor who tries to replace US control of trade routes, or the underpin security of trade routes throughout the region, and encourage everyone else to then join the Chinese-led regional order. And that's sort of the broad picture of what's going on. Now, how does the current war fit into that? So for that, we need to understand the current war not as a Israel-Hamas war, or even an Israel-Hizballah war, even though that's what we primarily want to talk about today, but rather it's an Israel-Iran war. That is what's going on today. And it's confusing because most of the fighting is going on in Gaza up until last night. But in order to understand that, we need to understand Iran's broader regional strategy and how all of that sort of led to the war of the past half year. So Iran's regional vision for the region is that Iran becomes the regional hegemon. Not that it necessarily directly controls or directly takes over the governments of the region, but it makes the situation that all those governments are essentially beholden to Iranian interests and are not able to imagine acting against them. It wants to then, if it succeeds in doing this, then it will control a large amount of the world's energy. It will control the critical waterways for international shipping. And the more steps it takes toward realizing this vision, it then will become the invaluable strategic partner for China and Russia in their bid to upend the US-led order in East Asia and Europe. Because if in a scenario of a US-China war, if in such a scenario, the goods and the energy coming out of the Middle East is going to be critical for China's war effort or for China's continued existence. And so the question is, who is going to be the dominant power of the Middle East at that time? And if, to the extent that Iran continues on its path that it's been relatively successful at over the past 20 years, then that means that's going to be Iran, and that means China, meaning that the other states are beholden to Iran, which is in collaboration with China. How does it go about doing this? It goes about doing this by opportunistically, by searching for anywhere where there's a power vacuum and Shiite populations. It can then looks to fund, train, and arm, and export its ideology to those populations and build up its proxy forces. So Hizballah is, of course, the biggest and longest standing and most aligned one with Iran. But of course, you could go into a lot more detail, but just to mention that it's essentially started, Hizballah aside, started in Iraq, post Saddam Hussein. It then got a great leap forward in the 2010s fighting ISIS, which then the local tribes, the local militias became beholden to Iran in order to get support in fighting ISIS, and the West was sort of allowing that to happen because it was also involved in fighting ISIS. Also in the 2010s, supporting the Houthis in Yemen, which then the more that they showed their capability to bring success, to be successful, the more Iran to support them. And then in a closer circle, which is supporting Hamas and Hizballah by funding, training, and arming all of these proxies around the country. Now, the successes have been that Iran de facto essentially holds a veto over any major Iraqi policies today. Even though the Iraqi state is technically still aligned with the United States, in practice, it's the Iranian-backed militias who have the veto over anything that would be done there, any kind of use of force or security issues in Iraq, and essentially can undermine the Iraqi government itself. The same thing has happened in Syria as the rebellion and the Assad regime lost control over a lot of the country, and Iranian proxies came to its aid. It has now become the Syrian regime. Assad regime is essentially beholden has become more beholden to Iran and its proxies and its ability to project power throughout Syria. And now we also see the results in Yemen over the last 10 years, where it's Iran's proxy which has taken over a large portion of the country and sits along the main ports, threatening Bab el-Mandeb Straits. So that is what's been going on until we met the Hamas attack on October 7th. Right? The Hamas attack on October 7th would not have happened without Iran's policies of Iran's build-up, funding, training, building what they call the circle of fire around Israel. Of course, it's also targeting Saudi Arabia, UAE, and any U.S. military presence in the region. But the Hamas would not have been able to undertake the attack of October 7th. Hizballah, of course, wouldn't be able to undertake the war of attrition that it's for the past half year that's going on, and what lays in the balance of Israel's victory, or Israel with the necessity of Israel's victory against Hamas and Hizballah, and now also Iran itself, that a price needs to be paid for directly against Iran. What lays on the balance is not just Israel's continued existence and Israel's security. It's the overall trajectory of where the entire region is going to go over the next 5 to 10 to further years, because all of the countries around the region are looking to see what's going to happen to Israel and what's going to happen with Gaza and on the north. Is Israel able to come back and finish the job and as against the Sunni Islamist semi-state or small state that invaded it on October 7th, and is the United States, which proposes itself to be the security backer of Saudi Arabia and UAE and other states in the Gulf, if it's going to actually support its closest ally in attaining its decisive victory or not. Because it's very clear to them, the logic that Israel is obviously the closest ally to the United States. But if the US is going to somehow undermine Israel's victory, its ability to have to become victorious over Hamas, even in Gaza, then they're going to say to themselves, why are we, or how could we possibly rely on the United States to then somehow back us against our direct threats, which is of course Iran, and as well as Houthim and its proxies in the region. And then the logic is very clearly to then hedge its overall superpower support, go closer to China, and even seek to try and rein in Iran by showing it that it can draw down the war in Yemen, and which is what Saudi Arabia has been doing, and the UAE as well, try to lower its security initiatives and try to lower the flames and show to Iran that, look, we're not threatening you, we're not going to push back against your proxies. We can be all right as long as you don't directly threaten us, because if Iran were to try and attack Saudi Arabia or UAE with the same type of attack that it did Israel yesterday, I'm doubtful that we would see anywhere near the extent of success in intercepting the drones, and they know that, and everyone knows that. So what's really lying in the balance of the current war, again, of course, it's existential for Israel, both in Gaza as well as in the north, which is I'm going into more detail momentarily. But it is what lays in the balance is the overall question of geopolitical dominance across the Middle East. Okay, now I want to go in a little bit more detail about Israel's north. So here, actually, I really need to show you some pictures. So let's see if I'm going to try that one more time. We'll do it through PowerPoint, even though it won't look as nice, but you'll get the idea. Let's do that. Okay, can Christine can just confirm for me that you're seeing the picture here?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Can see.
Great. Okay, so fundamentally, Israel has more or less geographically secure borders on three sides, on the west, south, and east. And so I think that the best way to understand this is by looking at the photos. The image is worth pictures worth 1,000 words. So of course, from the east is the Mediterranean Sea. From the south, the west. From the southwest is the Sinai Peninsula, which of course Israel has been attacked by Egypt in the past through the peninsula, but there's a big desert. It's not easy to cross. And since 1979, we have a demilitarized situation. So Israel has reasonably protected border in the Sinai. Of course, it must continue to stay demilitarized. And, that's a question mark looking forward, but that's more or less, taken care of. Also, the southeast and more or less to the east, we're looking at vast areas of desert. Very low populated areas of desert, difficult to traverse, difficult to invade from, not a lot of large population from which to mount an attack in the first place. Of course, the Jordan Valley all along the eastern border is also a natural barrier. And of course, I'm taking it for granted for the moment that Israel's security barrier in its east is the Jordan Valley, and it will stay that way, whether formally or informally. And of course, it can't be any other way. And we could talk about that further, but I'm not going to go into those pictures right now because I want to focus on the north. Just taking a look at geographically, you can also get an idea for population density, looking at the place at night. That to the east and to Israel's east and south is largely desert wasteland for many, many kilometers. Looking at the north, of course, is a different story. Also, if we look up here, we can see the continuous populated areas. And if we look geographically as well, before Israel controlled the Golan Heights, since 1967, then of course it was directly threatened by the higher plain. There's a reason it's called the Golan Heights. And it was directly threatened by Syria, which could easily shoot rockets and artillery at the Galil, at the valley below, at the agricultural settlements below. But controlling the Golan Heights and the Hermon, while it's obviously a strategic imperative, it doesn't close off the issue of threats from the north. Because Israel's border in the north, which you can see here on the yellow line, doesn't run through any geographically logical area at all. It's the result of Sykes-Picot 100 years ago, various geographically irrelevant drawing borders, which essentially runs directly through the northern mountain range, which is a continuous mountain range both in Israel's Galilee and southern Lebanon. And this makes protecting the area more difficult, both against invasion, both against rocket attacks. Along most of this area, saving the area of the Golan and the Hermon, saving the area of the Hermon, where Israel has strategic dominance because it's sitting on the higher ground. Most of that area across the Galilee, Israel's side is on lower ground, is on strategic lower ground, meaning as it looks across the next kilometer facing Hizballah is always at an advantage, looking into Israel. The nearest, more or less geographical barrier in Israel's north is about 20 kilometers north, and we go here looking at the Litani River. Here we can sort of can make out the valley coming down from the Hermon out to the Mediterranean, and that's the Litani River, and that's the closest thing that might be a secure geographical border in the north. Another factor that must be understood is Israel's population concentration in the greater Tel Aviv area, which we can see very clearly over here. There's Tel Aviv Tel Aviv in the greater Tel Aviv area off to the left, just to the south and right bottom, the lower right is Jerusalem. Over to the far right is Amman in Jordan. And so that means that even though Israel's population of 10 million is spread out over the country, a large percentage of that is sitting within the tens of kilometers between Hadera and Gedera. and that makes it more vulnerable to rocket threats, and of course it makes it more difficult to continue to directly control and both have governance and of course defend against its periphery, both in the south and the north. Okay, so now I want to take a look at previous wars in southern Lebanon. So this next part of what I'm sharing with you, I published recently as a long-form article in Mosaic magazine. I encourage anyone who wants to read the full version to look it up. Just searching my name, Mosaic magazine, you'll find it. And there I go into more detail than what I can do here, but let's just touch on the history. The issue of the threat to Israel from the north is nothing new. Now, on the one hand, we have the Lebanese state, which, although it did invade Israel in 1948, since then it has not sought to war with Israel, and it's even been the most likely to find diplomatic and cooperation with, because of the large Christian population, which has been essentially aligned with Israel since its founding. On the other hand, Lebanon is today it's more or less a failed state, and it has always been a weak state. Weak in the sense that it hasn't shown its own capability of controlling and effectively governing the area of its south, the area bordering Israel. So in the first few decades, that wasn't a big issue, but it became an issue when the PLO was kicked out of Jordan and opened shop in southern Lebanon, and it established what it called the Fatah land. Of course, the PLO, anyone who's not familiar, was established in 1964. 1964, and that's important because the Palestinian Liberation Organization means it wants to liberate the entire land from Jews and from Israel. It has nothing to do with the territories Israel has been controlled after 1967, namely Judea and Samaria and Gaza up to 2005. Rather, its entire goal is to destroy Israel. And so that's what it was founded for, and that's what it continues to be dedicated to in the long term. The only thing that changes is its tactics. So PLO took up shop in southern Lebanon and began its campaign of terrorism against Israel, international terrorism. PLO, Yasser Arafat, essentially the father of international terrorism in the 1970s, and its attacks both within Israel and shooting across the border killed hundreds of Israelis and injured thousands more over the 1970s up until the First Lebanon War. But after a particularly heinous attack in Israel against a bus of civilians, killing tens of civilians, Israel opened the Operation Litani in 1978. And it essentially invaded southern Lebanon in order to go after the PLO. It remained there for a few months, and then it withdrew back to the border, and this was established. This is the time when the UNIFIL, the UN forces in southern Lebanon, was established in order to keep the peace, maintain stability, prevent terrorism, PLO terrorism in southern Lebanon. And Israel also began to work with Christian militias in southern Lebanon, who also were enemies of the PLO. And that went on for a few years, but relatively swiftly it came clear that was not working. UNIFIL, since its founding, has been fundamentally incapable of meeting its mandate of keeping the peace. It's it drives around, it looks around, and it's present, but the ability to use force to prevent terrorists from acting and embedding themselves and arming themselves is not something that international forces are willing or capable of doing. And so within a few years, the PLO terror threat just continued to grow. It grew in its rocket threat, and it also grew as the PLO established itself as a more proper military, planning on invading actual Israeli cities across the border and launching in 1981 large rocket barrages across all of Israel's northern region. And this became unacceptable at some point, and Israel started thinking in bigger terms of what can it do beyond what it did in the Operation Litani, to fundamentally uproot the PLO from southern Lebanon. And so, of course, I'm going really quickly through a story that can be told in a lot more detail. But by summer of 1982, the situation was such that Israel felt it had to act in order to kick the PLO out and remove its terror threat to the north of Israel. Now, when Israel launched the first Lebanon war that summer, it did it with three main goals in mind. The first and most direct goal was to eliminate the PLO terror threat to the northern region of the country. If we can mute, I hear some other noise in the background. If everyone can mute themselves, that'd be great. Its second goal, strategic goal in doing so, was to confront the Syrian presence. Now, I'll remind everyone, Syria established its own military foothold in Lebanon following the Lebanese civil war, and it was essentially trying to build itself up, both to turn Lebanon into a Syrian, be under its control, and then also turn it against Israel and use it as a platform for itself to continue invading Israel. It called this at the time to attain strategic parity. What does that mean? Up until then, throughout the 1960s and 70s, Syria felt that it had to have Egypt's cooperation in order to invade Israel and threaten Israel, because it couldn't balance Israeli power on its own. But the idea of its continued presence in Syria and what it was working toward more generally, was to maintain what it called strategic parity, meaning the ability to go to war with Israel on its own. And after it planted surface-to-air missiles in southern Lebanon in order to restrict Israel's ability to act against PLO targets, this became a much serious issue. And so one of the second goals of the war was to confront the Syrians' military presence in southern Lebanon, or across Lebanon, and hopefully kick them out and lead to a Syrian withdrawal, but at very least make them pay a price and limit their capabilities there. The third and final goal was to bring about a larger political change within Lebanon, meaning that Israel sought to bring about the election of the Christian factions in Lebanon, which were pro-Israel themselves, and sought to then sign a peace agreement with Israel. And that way they would bring Lebanon out of the Syrian camp, and remind everyone, of course, 1980s, we're still in the Cold War, would also essentially flip Lebanon onto the Western camp in the broader Cold War. Long story short, toward the first aim, Israel was very successful. Within a month and a half, it had led to it had taken the PLO's all of main arms buildup. It had led to an exodus of PLO terrorists from Lebanon and to sending them across the Arab world, mostly in Tunisia, but across the Arab world. And it essentially decimated the PLO terrorist presence in Lebanon. And the second goal facing the Syrians, it was moderately successful, having had significant confrontations, dealing like a big military price to the Syrian Air Force in Lebanon, and establishing a stronger deterrence, but it did not manage to lead to a withdrawal. On the third account, it did lead to an election of installation of the pro-Israel Christian leadership who signed an agreement with it, but the first one was assassinated within a few weeks, and the second one, although he nominally signed an agreement, had no control to actually apply that, and Lebanon remained under Syrian's thumb in the broader sense. Of course, it then established the security zone. So I want to get to today, so I'm going to have to move a little bit quicker. But we can see here the extent of the security zone that lasted for 15 years, where Israel, along with the South Lebanese Army, which is a Lebanese Christian army that it cooperated with, continued to operate and to maintain a buffer zone in southern Lebanon in order to prevent what was now founded as Hizballah from attacking and invading Israel. So there was a few operations in the 90s. So I would like to talk more about the security zone, although I think it's more important that we get to today. So the security zone, bottom line, that it was successful in preventing invasion of northern Israel by Hizballah, and it was moderately successful in preventing rocket attacks, at least for the first half of the 15 years. But then in the 1990s, 1992, later, the rocket attacks were significant. And by 2000, the issue of Israel staying in southern Lebanon was a significant issue. And just to put it succinctly, on the one hand, you could say that there was broad consensus in Israel that it would like to withdraw in the context of a deal that would lead to Hizballah's either dismantlement or at least pushing away from the border. But there was not significant support for Israel's unilateral withdrawal, definitely not across the security establishment and the IDF, which opposed the idea of unilateral withdrawal. And in much parts of the rest of Israeli society, because it was understood that if Israel withdrew without dealing with Hizballah, then it would be essentially handing over the area to Hizballah, which would then set itself up across the border, along the border, and also be a windfall to terror across the region and a big price for Israel's overall deterrence, which is exactly what happened when Israel withdrew in the year 2000 unilaterally. This, of course, led to Hizballah building up its arms and continuing kidnapping and attacks, which led to the Second Lebanon War, which has sort of a balance, which on the one hand was a success in the sense that Israel established a level of deterrence against Hizballah, that it showed that the entire country would pay a high price for attacks against Israel. On the other hand, it was not a big success in actually addressing Hizballah's threat and dismantling it, and even addressing its ability to continue firing rockets at Israel, which it did to the last day of the war. And it did establish, though, with the war, which ended with the Security Council Resolution 1701, which essentially demanded both the end of the ceasefire, but said that Hizballah would withdraw to north of Litani, also reiterating previous resolutions that called for Israel that all of the militias disbandment and disarmament across Lebanon. So neither of those things, of course, have been implemented. Quite to the contrary. Since 2006, Hizballah has amassed an incredible rocket threat and ground invasion threat unknown since any of these previous periods, going from a rocket arsenal of a few thousands to over 150,000 regular rockets, which include also long-range rockets. I'm going to skip over here so you can see just the extent of Hizballah's rocket and missile threat to Israel, meaning the stupid rockets, non-precision ones can cover the entire north, and those that are in the tens, hundreds of thousands. And there's also thousands of longer precision range rockets that cover the entire geography of Israel. Okay, so this sort of brings us up to where are we today? And so since the beginning of the war, since Hamas's attack. So Hamas's attack put Nasrallah in a difficult situation. Why? Because on the one hand, this was something that Nasrallah has been planning to do in like a similar type of attack. This is what it's building itself up for. But Hizballah in its own eyes is supposed to be the leader of the resistance, quote unquote resistance to Israel. And Hamas sort of stole the show by invading and massacring Israelis in an unprecedented way. So on the one hand, Hizballah was now one-upped by Hamas. On the other hand, it wasn't about to begin an all-out war and draw Israel into an all-out war with itself on Hamas's schedule and on Hamas's terms. because Hizballah is there, is set up in southern Lebanon not to serve Hamas's interests, but to serve Iran's interests. It's there to deter or to threaten Israel and to raise the price of any Israeli action against Iran, against its nuclear programs, and also to be there ready and waiting for when Iran wants to make its larger move against Israel. And that's what it's there for. And so it understands if it were to draw a larger Israeli invasion into southern Lebanon before it's ready and not on Iran's terms, then it's missing its entire purpose for existing. On the other hand, it couldn't just sit back and do nothing. So Nasrallah essentially decided on a middle ground where it would begin a war of attrition, where it would shoot into Israel in an unprecedented fashion since 2006, and be part of the war, although it would also limit its attacks against Israel to a way that would make it in Israel's interest to wait and defer any larger scale invasion or dealing with Hizballah. And so that's essentially the situation for the past 6 months. Hizballah has been attacking Israel daily with rocket attacks, tens of rocket attacks, mostly directed at military sites, but also at towns, Israeli towns, and agriculture across the north of the country. It is also slowly, and there's been a slowly sort of raising the bar, meaning these rules, the rules of engagement are not set in stone, are not exactly understood by both sides. So it has also threatened Israeli Air Force strategic military installations across the north. It has lobbed rockets near Haifa. And it has also, since the beginning of the war, put the Radwan special forces, which are essentially the forces that have been training for ground invasion of Israel and mass massacre, which would make the Hamas attack look tame. That's what they've been training for. That's what they were set on the border since the beginning of the war. Today they're along the border in certain places and less in other places, but they're ready and waiting to be able to do that. And that's the situation. So I show you here in just an example of a day or two of rocket threats, of barrages from Hamas. Israel, the IDF, in retaliation, continues to strike back both against the terror organization's military capabilities and its command structure. And there's a sort of a tit for tat that Hizballah might raise the bar, and Israel will raise the bar even a little bit higher, going for higher people in the command structure and slightly deeper into southern Lebanon. But neither one wants to invade at the moment, because if this has been comfortable both for Hizballah and it's also been comfortable for Israel, who is one who would rather prefer to avoid a two-front war as long as possible, if possible. It doesn't mean Israel's given up on the north, and that's what we'll talk about in a moment. But if it can continue to focus on dealing with Hamas in the south and then delay Hizballah to the second phase of the war, then Israel has, while it still, takes a price from Hizballah and continues to retaliate in the limited fashion. So Israel's preferred to do that. Although it needs to be understood that this current situation leaves over 80,000 Israelis who are internally displaced in the country. They're essentially refugees in their country. People tend not to call them that, but that's what they are. They've been forced to leave their towns and their homes because Hizballah threatens their existence by bombing them across the border. Israel officially evacuated a more or less 5-kilometer region along the border, but because the entire north is really open to threat and rocket threat, another significant portion of Israelis even below that official evacuated strip have evacuated, and they are now living in exile within the country for almost half a year now. And this, of course, is unacceptable of course, it's unacceptable in the short term, but it's even more unacceptable in the long term. And this is the biggest reason that is going to force Israel's hand to take care of the situation as soon as feasible. Of course, the longer this is allowed to go on, it becomes a threat, not just a humanitarian threat or a threat to the property and the houses that are being destroyed, but it essentially, Israel has currently established a security zone within its own territory, right? Just to understand the severity of allowing such a situation to continue. It would be a threat not only to northern Israel, it would be a threat to the entire country. It's an enormous threat to Israel's deterrence, that it's not capable of restoring security to a large swath of the country. This is a huge tourist area, both for internal Israeli tourism and external tourism. It's a huge agricultural area. And the longer that this continues, it will essentially become a wasteland and no-go zone. And so this is obviously untenable in the long term. The only reason it hasn't been changed is because Israel has been busy prosecuting a war, deep, difficult urban warfare to retake Gaza from Hamas. Okay, so what are Israel's options currently? So I said again, Israel wants to finish the job in Gaza, at least bring it to a level where it has conquered the entire of Gaza and brought the continue fighting and holdouts within Gaza to a simmer that it can maintain, while then it turns its primary attention to the northern front. So what could happen? On the one end, there could be some sort of non-committal ceasefire, meaning one scenario is that as soon as Israel brings the fighting in Gaza to a low simmer, Hizballah will then say, we're just going to stop shooting rockets. And we expect Israel to do the same. Right? Of course, this would be a huge win for Hizballah, because then it would have shown that it's capable of destroying hundreds of Israeli towns all across the country, and it would then maintain its positions, forward positions along the border, maintain its ability to put its Radwan ground invasion forces across the border to continue to threaten Israel at the time of its choosing, and then it put the ball in Israel's park to then present Israel as the aggressor if Israel refuses a simple ceasefire. So for all of those same reasons, which would be a huge win for Hizballah, Israel cannot accept that. Its casus belli has been a half a year of rocket barrages and attacks on its territory, and the fact that, of course, allowing a hostile invasion force to set up across the border should be unacceptable in any normal country, but especially Israel post-October 7th is not going to be willing to accept that situation just on the sort of vague promise that we won't invade in the near future, or assumption that it would be deterred from doing so. Of course, there's likely Israel can't force its residents to return to their homes under such circumstances, and they most likely wouldn't, because it's a consensus in Israel's population that we are not going to allow ourselves to sit like sitting ducks across the border while a terrorist monster whose entire reason for existence is to destroy you to sits across and waiting across the border under the general threat of deterrence. So just a non-committal ceasefire would be unacceptable, although I could see some, that situation might continue for a few weeks or some sort of limited amount of time while Israel brought the forces to the north, rearmed itself, got itself ready for the initiative or for the next stage of a larger war. In that midterm, then obviously Israel would then bring its forces along the border, and then this would not allow the population to return yet, but it could sort of minimize damage by holding the border and then rebuilding itself and getting itself ready for the next step. The second scenario, which is sort of on the table, is an American brokered deal. And the details of the deal that have been released over the past months are more or less a Hizballah would pull itself back to some sort of line, either along the Litani or somewhere between 8 to 10 kilometers of the border. And in exchange, the expectation is for Israel to concede various areas along the border that Hizballah claims are Lebanese territory. Of course, none of these territories were decided to be to have a Lebanese claim to them when the UN looked into the issue and established the blue line. If anything, the territories claimed by Hizballah could be claimed by Syria, but that's a different issue, and that's in part of the Golan Heights. Moreover, I will show you here, this is the view from one of the main territories claimed by Hizballah called the Sheba Farms, which is known as Mount Dov, Har Dov. And it is nothing, it's not a farm. It's calling it farms are very misleading. This is a strategic highland on the side of the Mount Hermon, which overlooks the entire area, both into Lebanon and into the valleys in Israel and across Israel's north. So this is not a bunch of farmland. This is a strategic position that if Hizballah were to sit on it, it would then be in a much more advantageous position to then invade Israel and continue to threaten it if Israel were to be give in to the extortion and the entirely unbased claims of Hizballah to want to have it. Of course, Israel's not about to agree to that, definitely not in the current circumstances. On the other hand, Hizballah is also not going to agree to pull itself back by any significant degree to the Litani or 10 kilometers north. Just 2 months ago, Nasrallah made a comment that it'll be easier to bring the Litani waters up to the border of Israel than to bring Hizballah's forces from the border with Israel up to the Litani. And even if it somehow did, it would essentially just be a ruse to sort of show that it was, outwardly that it was receding its forces to the north, where it would easily continue to operate under civilian clothes across the Shiite villages in the southern border. This is essentially what Hizballah has been doing, because Hizballah, according to the end of the 2006 war and UN Resolution 1701, is not supposed to be operating in this area in the first place. And initially, in the first few years, it operated on civilian clothes and under civilian cover. And then slowly, since then, it has become more and more brazen in operating in the open. We have this current situation. So even a Hizballah pullback would not really be reliable, because they wouldn't actually be pulling themselves back in a significant way. So this obviously leads to the only acceptable option. Of course, there is an acceptable option for Israel, which is that the Hizballah decides to, or is coerced into observing the terms of 1701 and taking itself and legitimately, obviously, to being dismantled, and at the very least pulling its forces back to the Litani. Just according to the UN resolutions that the United States and all of the superpowers were a party to, and who resolved that this should be the case back in 2006. And if Hizballah were to do that, I'm very sure that Israel would then forego the adventure of having another invasion into southern Lebanon. I would do that happily. But I don't see that as being a significant, a likely scenario either. So, of course, this leaves the only force around who is willing to force Hizballah out of its positions along the border, as well as deal a significant blow and hopefully a major blow to all of the capabilities that it is that is built up over the last decades to threaten Israel, particularly the stockpiles of precision and long-range missiles, which threaten the entire country. Of course, also to the thousands of ballistic rockets that threaten its northern region, and this is basically the only thing that could be done and is most likely to be. Now, this still leaves one open question, which is, let's say that's what happens, and Israel is forced to invade and push Hizballah out, deal a significant blow to its capabilities, its leadership, its activists, obviously between 40,000 soldiers or militants, and let's say it does all that. How is Israel to then prevent Hizballah from rearming after it does that? Because let's say we're to do that, it could take a few weeks, a few months, depending on how far it went and how to what extent of Israel went after all the capabilities. But then what? Of course, this question, the fact that this is a difficult question with no clear answer, doesn't mean Israel shouldn't go ahead and do it, because the more immediate interest is that it's currently, like I outlined, the current situation is untenable, and it essentially has to act. But how would it go about thinking about making it worthwhile and preventing Hizballah from rearming in the first place? First of all, I need to preface and say that Israel acting significantly against Hizballah, I want to go back to the beginning of our talk, it would not just be a victory in the sense that it would allow Israel's northern residents to live in security, that it would remove a big threat that they can or a large portion of the threat that Israelis have lived under for the last 20 years. It would be a significant blow to Iran's broader strategy across the region, because we must remember Hizballah is the most capable and the most closely ideologically aligned proxy, who is essentially integrated into the Iranian decision-making process. It would be also an ideological blow to Iran, the very fact that Israel was capable and followed through with dealing a major blow to its proxy in Lebanon. Currently, Hizballah is de facto the most significant political actor in Lebanon as well. If this doesn't happen and the current trajectory is allowed to continue, Hizballah will continue to gain influence in Lebanon, to the extent that eventually it'll turn Lebanon into one more Islamic Republic of Lebanon, under the entire country being run as an Iranian proxy. And that's the current trajectory. But this also has the side effects of releasing Lebanon from the hold of Hizballah, which could possibly turn around the direction of Lebanon, and in the broader sense, turn around the overall strategy of Iran to establish its regional dominance. Because Hizballah is, again, it's the strongest proxy, but it's also involved in training other proxies in Syria, and training and supplying the Houthis in Yemen. And so a significant blow to Hizballah is a huge blow to Iran in its broader strategy. Of course, and so just to finish off, in order to prevent any whatever's left of Hizballah's rearmament, there needs to be, I can't say exactly what to do. It's obviously not clear. Israel is not going to control Lebanon or take over Lebanon. So what can it do? On the one hand, there needs to be an air element of constant vigilance to prevent rearmament. So Israel has essentially been doing that in order to prevent Iran's bid to establish a new stronghold in southern Syria. And this is called the Mabam in Hebrew, the war between the wars, where Israel acts to strike at arms transfers across Syria, which are meant for Hizballah and meant for Iranian proxies in South Syria. And let's say in South Syria, while it hasn't entirely prevented Iran from establishing a presence there, it's prevented it from becoming something significant. So the only reason it hasn't done this in Lebanon is because Hizballah, it faces the threat of having a larger war with Hizballah if it were to act. So Israel hasn't acted within Lebanon to prevent, or in southern Lebanon at all, to prevent Hizballah's armament, because it sort of started this project too late once Hizballah was already a significant threat. So what it needs to do, though, is to reduce Hizballah's threat to an extent where it then cannot deter Israel from acting by threatening to then strike at it. Even though there might be some remnants of Hizballah, again, it's hard to know exactly how far Israel would go and to what percent it would decimate. Would it be a few kilometers? Would it be to the Litani further? To what extent of Hizballah's capacities capabilities it would be able to take out? I don't know. But it would definitely need to be able to take them out to an extent that they wouldn't be able to then re-threaten to have a huge war with Hizballah, with Israel, if it were to then act. There would also need to be a ground element, because air is not enough. And if you're not there on the ground, if you're not acting, if you don't retain the ability to act on the ground, then you're going to lose. And the difference between the situation in Gaza and the situation in Judea and Samaria is that exact ability. Israel's presence to have an intelligence gathering presence on the ground, and its ability to go in, let's say, to Area A, since Operation the Chomat Magen, defensive shield, in 2002, and since then it's reserved, even though it doesn't have a constant presence in Area A, it reserves the ability to go in and deal with terrorist threats when it needs to. And finally, of course, trying to deal with Hizballah's rearmament without dealing with the source is like trying to deal with a leak in your kitchen without by sopping up all the water constantly with towels and not trying to actually deal with the source of the leak. And of course, in order to do that, Israel's preventing rearmament, Hizballah rearmament, needs to include going to the source, which means striking Iranian interests, striking Iranian sites, forcing Iran to pay a price for its proxies and not hide behind its proxy forces and never have to be accountable for its actions. And in the broader sense, this should also be a return of a significant sanctions regime, which over the past 10 years has only really felt the difficult sanctions, macroeconomic sanctions, for a period of a year or so in 2011-12, and then again in 2019. In 2020, it only felt the real heavy pressure at that time. And of course, when it doesn't have heavy pressure, it has more money free to fund and arm its proxies. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop here. I'd be happy to hear any questions from our audience, both about what I said and about the situation and where we're looking. And thank you for your attention.